We like to say things like, why can't black people just get over it? Like, slavery was a long time ago, all right? Why can't they just move on? Well, this is sort of precious coming from people who set off fireworks every July 4th, because that's some old shit too, right? Like Independence Day, that didn't happen last week, right? We didn't break away from the British last Thursday. That's some old shit. But we're still celebrating that. So when it's stuff that makes us feel good, we love it. When it's stuff that makes us feel better than others, superior, like we're the greatest people in the greatest country ever struck off from the forehead of God Almighty, oh, we'll remember that forever. We just don't like the stuff that brings us up a little short, makes us look a little less than superior, maybe not quite as good as we'd like to believe. If you don't understand why the past affects the present, particularly around issues like enslavement, putting aside the inheritance of wealth and the lack thereof, part of which is certainly an explanation for why currently the median white wealth is 15 times the median African-American wealth and 11 to 12 times the median Latino wealth. Certainly that has something to do with history, who had access to resources and who didn't. But putting aside that, let's just understand something. The only reason Donald Trump is president right now is because of a little thing called the Electoral College, which was put in place by folks. See, we got this revisionist history that we've been spinning for the last couple of months about the Electoral College. Oh, you know, it was put in there to prevent tyranny. For real, you think? Do you really think that? Because I don't think that. Right? That might have been one of the things that folks were concerned about, but it was also put in because folks like the folks in Virginia, in the bigger slaveholding states, right, didn't want direct democracy or anything even remotely like it because it would have hurt them because so much of their population was not enfranchised, right? So much of their population in some areas, 40% or over half of the people in some of those slaveholding states were what? Disenfranchised, counted as 3/5 of a human being, not considered people. And if you had anything remotely resembling direct democracy, those states would have been harmed by that. So in fact, the Electoral College was in part a compromise with slaveholding states, states who were dependent upon enslavement as a mechanism of economic development so as to improve their political position vis-a-vis non-slaveholding states. So if you don't understand how slavery, because this is the point, right? Even if you don't think racism was key to Donald Trump's own campaign, which, you know, suggests to me that you might have been asleep for the last several months, even if you believe that, understand that racism in the 1700s, white supremacy embedded in the structure of the country at the founding of the country is most definitely implicated in his election because without the obeisance to the Electoral College, without that compromise, we know he would not be president right now. So that is why we have to think about the past, and that is why the past affects the present. See, inertia is not just a property of the physical universe. It is also a property of the socioeconomic and the political universe that we have to address. And it's important for us to address that as a systemic matter. See, this is the other problem. We talk about race and racism, right? That I think we got to move through if we're going to be effective. Because ever since the election, it's been very, you know, it's easy, I suppose, for people to, and they ask me this a lot, and you've probably, you know, sort of come up upon these kind of conversations where people are, you know, do you think Donald Trump's a racist? Donald Trump a racist? Are all of his supporters racist? All of these are the wrong questions, right? It isn't really about whether he's a racist or whether his supporters are racist or not. I would never, first of all, assume that all of anybody's supporters are anything. Right? I mean, that would just be ignorant. I would never say like, oh, the only reason you would ever vote for Donald Trump is because you're a bigot. Look, not only are not all of Donald Trump's supporters racist, not all of Hillary Clinton's aren't racist. Let's be clear about that. And in fact, in 2008, look, in 2008, I remember there were polls that came out like a month before the election, right? Where something like 28% of white Democrats who said, and I assume they were telling the truth, that they were going to vote for Barack Obama in a month or 6 weeks or whatever it was. 28% of white Democrats 6 weeks out from the election said, yeah, I'm going to vote for that guy. But they acknowledged to pollsters that they still believed at least one, if not several, racist stereotypes of black people to be true. So what does that mean, right? It means like, yeah, I don't like a lot of them, but that one's okay. Right? It's racism 2.0, but it, you know, it's some updated software, but it's running on the old mainframe. You know, it's some of the same old You just sort of repurposed it, you know, repackaged it. But if I believe that the larger group is dysfunctional, the fact that I carve out.
Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you're doing great from whatever you're watching me from. I like Tim Wise's video because he talks about things that a lot of white scholars, white professors are not always ready to talk about, but he's that one person that calls a spade and calls a spoon and not a big spoon. Perfect case scenario is the issue of Mr. Donald Trump and racism. The core relationship between Mr. Donald Trump and racism. Tim Wise's central argument is not that Mr. Donald Trump invented racism in American politics, but he weaponized it with unprecedented bluntness in this modern era. So Trump understood something many politicians only hint at: the racial resentment, especially among white voters who feel economically insecure, culturally displaced, could be mobilized directly, loudly, and repeatedly without the usual dog whistle. So instead of coded language, Trump normalized open hostility towards immigrants, Muslims, black protesters, and so-called inner cities, framing himself as the defender of a threatening white America. This was not accidental. All these things that you're seeing are strategic. And Mr. Donald Trump capitalized so much on racism. He capitalized so much on weaknesses of white America. And the weakness of white America is fear of being displaced, fear of their privilege being taken away from them. But there's something that they didn't see. They didn't see that there is a cost that they will have to pay. And right now, brothers and sisters, they are paying it because Mr. Donald Trump, he is genius and he knows what he's doing, and he played all white folks. So buckle up for this video. Tim Wise is going to be addressing one of the most important thematic concerns in this topic. So brothers and sisters, I'm your host and presenter, Redefining Stories. Until then, let's watch the video. I'll be back. I'll be giving my 2 cents in regards to this. Until then, see you.
An exception for one guy, right, or a handful of people doesn't change that it's still racist. So this isn't about like, oh, this person is awful and this person is great, and these people are awful and these people are great. We're all a mix of awful and great. It's the reality, right? We've all been conditioned to be racist and to be sexist and to be classist and all of this stuff, right? We've been hit with that stuff ever since we were kids. So none of us are completely free from that. The idea that we can divide ourselves into like the racist and the unracist is just nonsense, right? It's not about that. It's like if we ask if Donald Trump is a racist, it's sort of like asking if a drug dealer is also an addict. I don't know. And I don't care. Right? It's like with Donald Trump, it's like, I don't know if he gets high on his own supply, but I know what he's selling, right? So at some point, whether or not he's a racist, if he's actually manipulating on the basis of race, if he's using race and racial resentment and racial anxiety in order to get elected, the action is racist. It's not about somebody's core character. And this is something that the right has been manipulating for a very long time. Go back to 1981. There's a audio recording. You can Google this and listen to it yourself. 1981, Lee Atwater, who was for a long time, probably before Karl Rove, the most prominent conservative Republican consultant of the modern era. He had worked for Reagan. He worked for George H.W. Bush. He worked for all the sort of leading conservative Republican candidates through the 80s and into the 90s. He has since died of cancer. But before all of that, before he got sick, when he was still very much embedded in Republican conservative politics, 1981, there's an audio tape of him where he actually admits this as a strategy, right? He actually is on the tape saying, listen, back in the 1950s, you could say, and it's the N-word, I'm not going to say it. He says it in the tape like 3 times. He says it over and over and over again. And then he says, but by the 60s, late 60s, you can't say that word anymore. It gets you in trouble, so you start using other words like states' rights and crime and welfare, right? And taxes, right? And he says, and now you're getting so abstract, it sounds like it's all just about economics, but the real purpose and the point here is that black people get hurt worse than white people. So he's admitting, this isn't me saying this about right-wing folks. It's not me saying like, that's what they're doing, right? It's not Ian Haney Lopez, the author of Dog Whistle Politics, saying this is what they're doing. It's the guy who's actually originated the theory and the practice who's saying, yeah, this is the that we do. We just make up words and make up concepts and we sucker people with these ideas to actually hurt black folks. That is what we do. Now, Lee Atwater apologized for some of that before he died. Other folks have not. They keep doing it, right? And so when Donald Trump gets up and says, now see, the difference, right, is that like, there's a difference because Atwater was all about the dog whistle and Trump is like about the bullhorn, right? Like the dog whistle is you use coded language, but Trump was just like, screw it, Mexicans are rapists, right? And we're gonna stop Muslims. He didn't really learn all Atwater's lessons. Like Atwater been like, dude, just like, could we talk a minute? Like you're not really doing this right. Like you need to pull back. But by the end of the campaign, he was learning, right? He would talk about when he would address black folks, right? Of course, he never actually addressed black folks. He would go into white suburbs around black cities and talk to white people about black people. So he went to the suburbs of Milwaukee and had an all-white audience where he talked about the inner city, which is just interesting phrase, right? Because we haven't used that phrase to describe urban space in like 25 years. So he's still stuck in a mentality of, 25 to 30 years ago. He's like, the inner city is full of carnage and it's falling apart. Everything's terrible. You can't walk out the street without getting shot. Now, at the time, remember, everybody said, oh, you know what he's trying to do? He's trying to signal to people that he really cares about the black folks. He's trying to signal to those suburban white folks who might want to vote for him, but they're sort of like, oh, I think he's racist, that he's not because he cares about the black. That wasn't what he was doing, right? What he was doing by reminding white folks about how dangerous and dysfunctional and pathological and horrible black folks in the city were, was he was reinforcing their stereotypes and saying to them, I'm the one that can solve this problem. He wasn't signaling concern for those communities. He was and he was lying. He was lying because, in fact, violent crime in this country, including in black communities, is roughly half of what it was in the early 90s. That is a fact. And you can look it up and you can argue with him and he will ignore it because facts are fungible to him. And yes, there's been an uptick in the last 2 years in about half of the large metropolitan areas, but the other half, there's been no increase or even a decline in violent crime. Overall, violent crime down. Violent crime even in Chicago, a third below what it was in the early 90s. Violent crime in Los Angeles, 40% below what it was in the early 1990s, or 50% below. Crime in Washington, D.C. at a level it hasn't been seen since 1965. Black male homicide rates lower today than they were in 1950. Now that is what is factual, but we don't want to know about that because we want to paint certain communities as inherently dysfunctional, out of control, filled with carnage, because then we can turn our will over to the great man who can solve all those problems. How? Because he says we're going to do stop and frisk. We're going to turn the police loose, just like we did in New York because it worked so well. Stop and frisk, he says, worked so well in New York. Did it really? No, it didn't work. First of all, it's unconstitutional as hell. That's why it was thrown out. But more importantly, it didn't work at all. 88% of the people that were stopped were people of color, right? And only 6% of the people stopped even got a citation for jaywalking, right? 94% of the time, they hadn't done anything. 6% of the time, they got a citation for something, usually a very minor offense. Half of those got thrown out in court because there wasn't enough evidence to sustain the charge. So ultimately, 97% of the people stopped, and we're talking millions of people over a 14, 15-year period, hadn't done anything. But Donald Trump says it worked fabulously. Now, that fabulous is too big a word. He said it worked wonderfully. It was awesome. It was amazing. It was great. It was fantastic. It was the best. I mean, there's a thesaurus. It has other words. I'm sure there's one in the Oval Office. Right? He says, it was great, it worked wonderful. It didn't work because hardly anyone was guilty of anything. The theory was it was a good way to get drugs off the street. Well, they only found drugs in 1.2% of all searches. It's not very effective. They actually found drugs more often on the white folks they searched than the black and brown folks they searched. So in other words, the hit rates were better when you stopped white people, but they kept stopping black and brown folks disproportionately. So that's some pretty crime control, right? Tells you that the war on drugs ain't about drugs, right? But actually we know that, right? Like, I know that because if the war on drugs was about drugs, I don't know who'd be giving this talk to you, but sure as hell wouldn't be me. Because I don't think they let you Skype that in from prison. And I can tell you this now because the statute of limitations has expired and they can't touch me, but... Right. Oh, Jesus, don't applaud that. Like, what is that? Like, oh, white privilege, drug use, awesome. I'm gonna go get high tonight. Don't applaud that. That's horrible. I mean, it's a laugh line. It's not an applause line. Jesus, right? But it's true, right? So 1.2% of the time they found drugs, not a very good anti-drug strategy. The other folks, like the chief of police who brought the program in, said, oh, it's a great way to get guns off the street. Really? Okay, so in the 9 years that were under review in the court case on stop and frisk, they had 4.5 million stops under review over the 9-year period. You know how many guns they found out of 4.5 million stops? They found 4,500 guns. Do the math. It's 1/10 of 1% of the people whom they stopped actually had a gun on them. I could do better at finding guns in New York by just walking down the street and randomly tagging people, right? Just like walking up and being like, you got a gun? You'd be like, yeah, I got one right here. I'm sure I could find like at least 0.2 of 1%. Just like flipping a coin, like just randomly pointing people out, paintball, some shit, right? That's not a plan. It's not about crime control. It was about black and brown people control, right? That's what this is. So we have an individual who, whether or not he is racist isn't the question. It's about whether or not the policies, the practices, the procedures, the systems that he would put in place would further racism. That's the issue. It isn't about personal stuff, right? It's about systemic stuff. And we need to understand it that way also for the sake of the people that did vote for him, because we got to have two things that happen from here on. We got to have radical honesty, which means we got to call bullshit when it needs to be called, and we got to name things when they are in fact fascist and authoritarian and racist and things of that nature and sexist and all of that. We got to call it what it is. But we also have to have some radical empathy, and this is harder. Radical empathy is harder. It's way hard, right? Radical honesty is just about truth-telling, and that's sort of easy, particularly if you're already sort of radical. The honesty part comes easy because you can just be like, I'm just going to bust it off and tell you what's real. But the empathy part's harder, and it's particularly hard, I think, sometimes to be empathetic or empathic to people who empower the likes of the current president and do so in a way sort of maybe perhaps unthinking about what the consequence. And we've seen that, right? Because there's people that are like, well, wait, you're going to cut off the Affordable Care Act? What? Like, don't do that. Well, he told you he was going to do that. Like, why are you surprised? Like, well, I didn't think he was serious. Well, that's like going to a pizza party and being like, now, I hope y'all aren't planning on having pizza. Because I came for the spaghetti. All right, fool. It's a pizza party, fool. What the hell you think they're going to have? He told you pizza. You're going to get pizza. If he tells you, of course, people were like, well, I just thought he was going to cut the Obamacare, not the Affordable Care Act. Just the Obama part, just the part where they make me Muslim and issue me a passport from Kenya or whatever the hell that part was. That's what I thought that, But it's hard, right? When people do stupid, it's hard to be empathic. But here's why we have to be, because there are a lot of folks who fell for that. And let's be clear about it. We can joke about it because it's some stupid. But at the same time now, we have to be real about the fact that there's some folks who got suckered, yes, but you can only sucker people who are in pain. If I'm confident, if I'm in a good place, you're not going to fool me, right? If those peasants back in the 1700s hadn't been struggling and suffering, they couldn't have been fooled that way. If those poor white folks in the South hadn't been struggling, they couldn't have been fooled that way. If those folks on the labor unions hadn't been struggling, they couldn't have been fooled that way, right? We don't act on our best impulses when we're in a bad place. So if you've seen all these reports the last couple of, well, about 6 months to a year, right, about the opioid crisis, right, the heroin crisis and over-the-counter opioid addiction crisis in white America, right, in rural areas, small towns, yes. And there's actually a correlation between the level of opioid addiction and the vote for Trump. There's actually been interesting maps that have been created that show that the areas with the greatest levels of opioid addiction were some of the biggest support for Donald Trump. I don't think that's a coincidence. And I'm not trying to be snarky and say like they're all high and that's why they did it. That's not what I mean. That's not what I mean, right? What I mean is this. What is an opioid? What is it? It's something you take to block pain, right? You take heroin and it blocks pain receptors. You take oxy and it blocks pain receptors. That's what opiates do. Donald Trump is a walking, talking, breathing opioid for millions of white folks. So he comes along and says, you elect me, I'll block your pain receptors, right? You elect me and I'll take your pain away, see? And so folks who may not actually do actual opiates, right, look at him and he becomes this sort of embodiment of pain blockage. Now, here's the thing. If you're in pain and the pain is real and you're misdiagnosing the source of your pain, does that mean that I don't attend to your pain? Or does it mean that I try to help you figure out the actual source of it? If I have a pain in my side and I decide to consult Dr. Google, which is never a good idea, by the way. Dr. Google will have you thinking you're going to be dead by the morning. Let's be honest. If I have a pain in my side and I consult Dr. Google and I determine that I have cancer, I might be a fool. I'm likely to be wrong, but that doesn't mean that I'm not in pain. My pain needs attending to. I just need a better diagnosis. And so we got to figure out a way to demand accountability from those who empower racism at the same time that we have radical empathy that says your pain is real, but somebody is lying to you. And they've been lying to all of us for a very long time, you see? Because here's the thing that really strikes me. You know, after this election, people said the people that didn't want to attribute it to race, what was their argument? Their argument was, oh, you know, it's not race, it's economic anxiety. People are struggling, they're out of work in these coal towns in Appalachia or in the Rust Belt, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, right? And on one hand, you know, the economic anxiety and the struggle of people in those places is real. I'm not going to deny that, man. We haven't fully come out of the recession yet. Yeah, the jobs are starting to come back, but you know, the reality is that on average, they're paying about 20% less in the jobs that were lost during the recession. That's a fact. And the inequality of income and wealth has really not changed in the last 8 years. In some regards, it's gotten worse. Not the fault of the administration, but they didn't do enough to stop it. So there's some real struggle. There's real pain happening all over the country. So I'm not diminishing that at all. But it's interesting, isn't it, that we want to attribute his rise to economic anxiety because it can't just be that. Is it that? Yes, but it can't just be that. How do we know? Well, it's real simple because black folks are still twice as likely to be unemployed as white folks, even when they have a college degree. African-American folk with a college degree, 88%, almost twice as likely as white folks with a degree to be unemployed. So if it was just about economic anxiety, black folks would be flocking to Trump because they're the ones even more likely to be out of work. Oh, you're going to bring the jobs back? Well, then I'm down for that. But that didn't happen. Latino folk with a degree, 50% more likely than white folks with a degree to be out of work, but they didn't flock to Trump. Asian Americans with a degree, 25% more likely than white folks with a degree to be unemployed, but they didn't flock to Trump. Our indigenous brothers and sisters with a degree, 2/3 more likely than white folks with a degree to be unemployed. They did not flock to him. So the idea that it's just economic anxiety in the abstract cannot possibly be true, because the folks who were the most anxious happen to be the very folks who did not vote for him. So there's something else going on. What is it? Well, it's very simple. See, the difference between those folks of color and those white folks is that some folks already knew the system was a joke, and some people didn't. And here's what I mean by that. A couple years ago, there was a survey. It found that the most optimistic racial group in America in terms of the future and their opportunities were black people, and the most pessimistic were white people. Now think about that, but can you help me with this? White people were the most pessimistic, even though we were half as likely to be unemployed. We were 1/3 as likely to be poor. We had 15 times the net worth of black folks on average, 9 years more life expectancy, half the rate of infant mortality, half the rate of low birth weight children. In every single category of well-being, we generally had twice as much of the good stuff and half as much of the bad stuff, but we were still like, yeah, the wheels are coming off of this thing. Everything's going. And black folks who had twice as much of the bad stuff, half as much of the good stuff, were like, looking up. Now, how is it possible that the group that is in far better shape is so pessimistic? See, there's only one way to look at that. And that is that was all happening right around the recession when that poll was taken. And even though people of color were hurt even worse by the recession than white folks, lost a greater percentage of their wealth, more likely to be laid off, lose their jobs, et cetera. But there's an extent to which if you're black or brown in America, you already know, don't you? You already know that this system wasn't set up for you, that you can't assume anything, that working hard and trying hard and playing by the rules doesn't necessarily guarantee you a damn thing. The difference is white America, and particularly white men, have been sold that our whole lives. The idea that if we just play by the rules and work hard, the old saying in coal country and in the Appalachian areas and in the Rust Belt was what? As long as you're strong and have a strong back and can lift things, you'll always have a job. So you have a lot of these white working class folks that my daddy was a coal miner, his daddy was a coal miner, his daddy was a coal miner, his daddy was a coal miner, I'm a coal miner, and I want my son to be a coal miner, damn it. And he ought to be able to be that. Putting aside what it means to just assume the entitlement, right, that well, surely we're going to always have jobs, right? Even if they're jobs that give us black lung and kill us by the time we're 55 years old. The idea that I'm entitled, that my kids are entitled to that level of security. How many black and brown folks in this room ever had the assumption that you could just assume you could walk into a job just because your daddy had one or your mama had one or somebody in your family had one? No person of color has had the luxury of ever believing that, but these folks did. And then all of a sudden the economy shifted under their feet like wet sand. And they don't know what to do with it because the reality of having relative advantage, I don't mean a lot of privilege because these are struggling folks. I don't mean economic privilege. I don't mean class privilege, right? But the privilege of being able to take for granted that your identity as a white person would always mean that if you played by the rules and worked hard, things would work out was a setup. And those folks at the top weren't ready to actually confront the world in which they live. Black and brown folks already knew. Black and brown folks knew by the time they were 11 that it was a hustle. Right? But if you're a member of the dominant group, you don't realize that. So in a way, privilege was a setup, right? It was a way of saying to you that you'll never have to actually worry about this. And James Baldwin said something about this many years ago. He said that individual who has to snatch his humanity out of the fires of human cruelty that rage to destroy it learns something about himself in the process that no school and no church can teach. He gains a sense of his own authority, and that is unshakable because he has to look beneath the words. He has to read between the lines, can take nothing for granted. That individual who is constantly surviving the worst that life can bring ceases to be afraid of what life can bring. See, people of color are not afraid. And as a result of not being afraid, they face whatever is thrown their way. But if you're a member of the dominant group and you've never had to face that uncertainty because you were told that that uncertainty was not for you, that uncertainty was for those people over there on that side of town, those people over there across that border, those people over there who didn't work as hard, you see. And then all of a sudden you discover that this economy wasn't set up for your ass either. It was set up for a handful of people at the top that don't love you, that don't care about you, that just want for themselves. They'll just wall themselves off in gated communities and take care of their own stuff and not really care about any of us out there in the larger world. Once you discover that, what do you do with it? I had a guy write to me an email a couple years ago. He made this point very clear, right? He writes to me. He was out of work for 26 weeks. His name is Jeremy. He's like 40 years old. He says, tell me about my privilege. What privilege do I have? I've been out of work. I had to cash out my kids' college fund, sell everything I own. And it was a perfectly fair question. And I said, look, man, I don't know what to tell you. I'm really sorry about your situation because that's got to be horrible, being out of work for that long and being afraid about what's going to happen to your family. I wish I could help you. I wish I knew somebody in your industry. You sound like a good guy. Unfortunately, I don't know anyone that I could connect you to. And I said, but I am really sympathetic to your situation, and I think it's really a damn shame that anybody is facing 26 weeks of unemployment without certainty about what they're going to do to pay for their health care or take care of their kids' education or, pay their mortgage or whatever. I don't think that should happen. And because I was kind to him, he was kind in response, and we ended up having a dialogue. And I said, look, man, all I got for you is an analysis. That's all I can offer if you're interested. And I didn't really expect him to say that he was, because I figured, like, this dude's unemployed and pissed. He's like, an analysis? What the hell? Like, if I were him, I'd be like, screw you with your analysis. But, but he was like, whatever, I got nothing else to do today, so give me your analysis. I'm like, all right, here it comes, So I said, here's the thing, man. When you wrote to me, it was interesting. Your email said, and this is what he said, this wasn't supposed to happen to me. Very specific, right? He said, I did everything right. I played by the rules. I worked hard. I, worked over the weekends. I didn't take vacations. I came in early. I left late. All this blah, blah, blah stuff about how hard he had worked. And I said, Jeremy, when you say that, even though I don't think you meant it this way, it sort of comes across as this mentality of expectation and entitlement. What you're saying is, I deserve better. All these other poor schlubs on the unemployment line, they didn't work as hard as me. So even though you may not mean it to sound that way, it comes across like you're separating yourself from other people. And I just find that fascinating, because it says to me that you didn't understand what some of those other folks knew for the last 20 or 30 years since they were 11 or 12 years old, right? Which is that it happens. You just didn't think could happen to you. You didn't think that you could be facing this level of unemployment. Black and brown folks always knew that they could be facing this level of unemployment, because it isn't new for them at all. It's been a constant. What does it mean that you were able to envelop yourself in a bubble of obliviousness all of this time? What it means is that your privilege, even though you don't see it right now, has come back to bite you on the. And so now we better ask as a country what we're going to do about a system of privilege and inequality that is coming back to bite all of us on the. It is biting us right now. It is time that we bite back. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.
Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you're doing great from whatever you're watching me from. So, if it could be said, Trump is genius. Why? Because Trump is genius. It could be called that because was recognizing that he did not need to win the popular vote. He did not win to do that. He needed to dominate specific states where white grievance politics had already been slimmering. The Electoral College rewards geographic concentration and not national consensus. And Trump leaned into his reality by stoking racial fear and cultural panic. He energized turnout in rural and suburban white communities in swing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. All these states with long histories of racial tension, segregation, and economic decline tied to deindustrialization. Right. So, Tim Wise emphasizes that racism functioned as a unifying emotional language for Trump's coalition. So, many of Trump's voters were not wealthy elites. They were people who felt ignored by globalization and abandoned by neoliberal policies. Rather than blaming corporations or political elites, Trump redirected their anger towards immigrants, refugees, black activists, and coastal liberals. So racism became the shortcut explanation for complex economic pain. You are struggling because someone else is cheating you. That someone else was almost or always racialized. So, Trump's attack on Barack Obama, were a preview of the strategic. The Bata conspiracy was not just a misinformation. It was racial boundary setting. It questioned whether black men could ever truly be American. So Tim Wise argues these argues that this was Trump testing how far he could go, discovering that a large portion of the electorate not only tolerated racial disrespect, but they rewarded it. So the lesson Trump learned was simple. Transgression created loyalty. It created not backlash among voters who felt politically harmless but culturally dominant. So once in the 2016 campaign, Trump used racism to redefine political normalcy, calling Mexicans as rapists, proposing Muslim ban, and encouraging police brutality against suspects were not gapes. They were signals. Each statement told a specific audience, quotes and quotes, I will say what others are afraid to say, and I will protect you from demographic change, quotes and quotes. So Wise points out that Trump supporters often didn't deny the racism. Instead, they reframed it as telling the truth or political incorrectness, turning bigotry into rebellion. So that's how it all happened. Also, the Electoral College amplified this message because it allowed Trump to lose by millions of votes nationally while still winning the presidency. So Weiss argues that this exposed a deep structural problem. A system originally designed in part to protect slave-holding states now continue to dilute the political power of racially diverse urban populations. So Trump's racism did not need majority approval. It needed efficient distribution. And the Electoral College provided exactly that. Another key point was Weiss makes it that Trump benefited from white racial solidarity without requiring conscious racism from every supporter. Understand that many voters insisted they were not racists, yet still responded to narratives about crime, about welfare, about immigration, and national decline that were clearly racialized. So Trump didn't need explicit hatred. He needed discomfort, fear, and resentment. Racism worked less as ideology and more as emotional fuel, keeping voters angry, loyal, and distracted at the same time. So, Trump also exploited the myth of white victimhood. He portrayed white Americans, especially men, as the real victims of discrimination, mocked movements like Black Lives Matter, and framed racial justice as an attack on law-abiding citizens. Weiss notes that this inversion is crucial. So, by positioning the dominant groups as oppressed, Trump justified authoritarian solutions, harsh policing, border walls, and attacks on dissent under the banner of restoring order. And you need to get that the media also played a significant role in enabling this dynamic. Trump's racism generated constant coverage, and outlets often treated it as spectacle rather than threat. Weiss argues that the press frequently failed to connect Trump's rhetoric to historical patterns of racial scapegoating used by the demagogues. So by focusing on tone instead of substance, media normalization helped make open racism seem like just another political style rather than a deliberate strategy to divide and rule. And importantly, Dr. Tim Weiss rejects the idea that Trump voters were merely duped. While economic anxiety was real, racism provided the moral permission structure for supporting policies that would not materially benefit them. Trump promised to hurt the right people. And for many voters, that was enough. The emotional satisfaction of racial dominance often outweighed rational self-interest, a pattern seen repeatedly throughout the US history. So, Trump's presidency then validated this strategy, from defending Confederate symbols to attacking majority black cities and undermining voting rights. So his governance reflected the same racial logic as his campaign. Wise warns that Trump did not create a new America. He exposed an old one where racial hierarchy remains politically profitable, especially when democracy is filtered through undemocratic systems like the Electoral College. So, brothers and sisters, please let me know what you think about this. As you know, I'm your host and presenter Agent Stories. But until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Sword.